Alrighty. As I shared, this first conversation is going to be focused on talking about the SOFA in Asia, but it could, anyone can join us from any experience here. We're going to do a couple polling questions just to get a feel for those who don't want to, come off of my, mute. We can just answer those questions. And then what we're going to do is if we have to expand on those questions, or if there's an other or something, I would ask that someone raise their hand if they would like to share more. So the format will be, we're going to ask some questions after we first hear from Beth, who is our resident SOFA expert. And I know she might not say that, but she's been working really hard on the SOFA and knows a lot and is a really great resource, but also will set the tone for the conversation. We're going to ask those polling questions, and then I'm going to ask if anyone is interested in sharing more about their experience. If so, please do the raised hand feature. And then after that person shares for a few minutes, we'll give it about 3 minutes or so to share if we can. And after that 3-minute period, then I'm going to ask if anyone else has a different experience, something that is slightly different from that first response, so that we can kind of better understand the dynamics involved. After that, we're just going to go through as many questions as we have. And if we have time at the end, after answering those basic questions, then we'll kind of go one by one in case anyone has anything else to share. If you don't get to share your experience fully in this conversation, I am available. You have my email address if you want to continue the conversation offline. I'm happy to do that, because the purpose of this is to help me inform the stories that I write about this community and this particular topic. So that said, I'm going to mute myself and kick it over to Beth Conlon, who, as I said, has been working on the SOFA and is a military spouse herself. So Beth, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's 9 o'clock on the East Coast, so I see someone's drinking coffee. I'm about to have some tea. My name is Beth Conlon. I'm an active duty Army spouse. I was personally victimized by the Status of Forces Agreement a decade ago. And I have spent the last decade trying to better understand what is it about the SOFA that somehow complicates professional development or employment. What is it? What isn't it? What's true? What's myth? And over the last 10 years, I haven't got a lot of questions answered until really this summer. But what I have done is gotten a real clear understanding of where the SOFA does and does not impact our ability to maintain employment. And so I'm hoping to help. I want to hear from you guys, hear your experiences, and then I want to share as much information as I can, with the hope being that you will then pay it forward and share with others, so we can start to arm our spouses with the right knowledge and stop kind of living through this sort of fear-mongered state that I know I experienced when I went to Germany and then immediately to Korea. So I did 5 years back-to-back overseas. So I'm familiar with all versions of the Status of Forces Agreement. 2 summers ago, I was a fellow with the Bush Institute, and my project was to get clarity from the State Department and DoD on the Status of Forces Agreement. And then over the summer last year, I spent the last year working with the American Bar Association. I brought this problem to them, and they said, absolutely, this is a problem. So we spent the last year working on a resolution. The American Bar Association just adopted the resolution. So essentially what that means is the American Bar Association, it's sort of like, how like 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Crest toothpaste? It's kind of like that. Like the Bar Association has said, hard stop, this is a problem that needs to be solved. And there's 2 areas that need to solve it, for employers and for spouses. And so it's sort of an informal directive for the State Department and DoD to like get their act together. The Bar Association's opinion on that holds a lot of weight. So all of that to say, I am happy to answer any questions about your personal experiences or broad, vague questions. They can be country specific, region specific, job specific. I can get super nerdy on this, so I will try and keep it high level unless you want me to get into the weeds, because I will get into the weeds.
Awesome. Thanks, Beth. So if I launched the first poll question, I think that it says a certain number of people participated. So if anyone else has any responses to add, we can close that. No need. If it doesn't fit you exactly, it does give you a limited number of options in the the polling feature in Zoom. You can't just do an open-ended. So if nothing fits you, feel free to put other, and then, feel free to expand on that in the chat, and then we'll kind of go forward from there. But it gives a better understanding of what we want to cover. So it looks like, from what I'm seeing, most people are located in Japan if they are OCONUS right now, and or we have some stateside folks, but who are either considering or have lived OCONUS. So I'm going to close that one. But if anyone wants, let's see here, we'll share those results. And so just wanting to understand. So Japan sounds like it's one of the primary locations. The other question that we have that we really want to make sure we address is the employment, question. And so we want to understand if there is employment opportunities for you all. It looks like, let's see, for whatever reason, it is letting me, let's see, we're going to stop sharing that one and we're going to launch the new one. There we go. That's why it wasn't letting me share. So wanting to find out, are you currently employed, or while you were in that OCONUS environment, were you employed? And if so, we're going to get to the next question, which is looking at, your fields. So while we're talking about this, if you were employed, I'm going to ask this, but it's not going to be part of the polling question. If you did find employment, is anyone willing to kind of speak to that process? If that was something that you were able to retain a job that you had stateside and then moved OCONUS, or did you find it in that location? If someone's willing to share that experience, feel free to raise your hand and or come off mute. Okay, that's okay. If
I was gonna say, I'm happy to share my experience.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, so I was fortunate in that I took my United States job with me to Japan. And I think that it worked out for a number of lucky reasons. First one, always going to be a challenge, is time zones, right? Converting. And I was going from East Coast to Japan. So that's 12 to 13 hours, depending on the time of year. It just so happened my job stateside was working with night students. And so I worked awful hours in the United States. And then my husband got the option to go to Japan. I was like, holy cow, my job would be normal hours if we did that. And it was part-time remote. So I was able to take that job with me. Now, the time zones worked, but I'm like, oh goodness, we got to get this past HR. That's the real hurdle here, not the time zones. And luckily I was with a small company. They had about 100, 150 people. Flex in and out was more in the stable startup phase. So for them, they didn't really see a legal risk in letting someone work in another country. They didn't even know what SOFA was. It was just, I was going to be a telecommuting W-2 employee. Now, the big kind of nitty gritty hurdle was, what about taxes, right? And I saw that was one of the options. And we contracted out with ADP. And for some reason, the ADP system let me put in my APO address, and was able to see with like unemployment insurance, like having to pay that to a certain state. So again, it's one of those things just so small that like it really doesn't matter, but it does to one of those systems that's trying to put you in a box for like where you live or where you file taxes, or, unemployment insurance in a state that you're not in the United States. So I was very fortunate that my job did come there, and I worked there the entire time I was in Japan, working, mostly normal hours. I would have to get up between 4:30 and 6:30 for staff meetings that were happening on the East Coast time, but I didn't mind it because I just felt very grateful that I was able to bring that job with me. And it was truly like a diamond in the rough type situation.
Yeah.
Can I provide some background to that, Lauren? Because I like, you did totally fall into like a unicorn position. So the reason Lauren was able to do this. So here's what I'm going to get real nerdy for a second. So if you work for a global employer, I work for Amazon. If your company has a legal entity in that country, by law, you are required to tax equalize yourself to that nation. So if I was to be with Amazon in Korea, I'd have to work from the Seoul office and get paid in won, and I'd have to pay taxes in Korea. Quick caveat to all of that. We have bilateral taxation agreements with pretty much every country that says if you live there for less than 5 years, when you leave, you can get your Social Security taxes back. because most countries have a much higher tax rate than we do. And so you will notice a drastic pay cut when you live overseas. But because Social Security taxes are, you wouldn't have used them because you left the country, you can apply to get those back. And it is very much worth it, considering places like Germany, their tax rate's like 40%. So there's that. If you are working for a large multinational company, when you go overseas, if there's an entity there, you have to sort of convert yourself over. Now, what Lauren's talking about, or Laura, sorry, what Laura's talking about is a lot of employers stateside. If you are small and you don't have a presence outside of the US, a lot of employers will use the Military Spouse Residency Relief Act just as if you were in the States. So for example, I live in Georgia right now. I'm a Washington resident. Washington doesn't have any income taxes. And so Amazon pays me as if I'm in Washington, even though I live in Georgia. But for my HR, I have a lived-in address and a worked-in address. And so they tax me at my worked-in address, but for mail or any notifications, I have my lived-in address. A lot of small US-based employers have leaned into that and said, I'm okay taking that risk. If you want to go to Germany, as far as I'm concerned, you're a Virginia resident, just not living in Virginia. It's no different than if you were in the States. There have been a few small law firms, Parlatory Law is one of them, that have really dug into that, and they have said that would stand up in court. But I will say all that to say that that is a risk that employers are willing to take, or some are not willing to take, right? So just keep that in mind if you're thinking like, how in the heck did she keep her job? There is the Military Spouse Residency Relief Act is something that smaller employers do feel comfortable leaning into.
Thank you so much, Beth. And that's why these types of conversations have an expert in the room so that we can kind of address why that's an unusual situation. Does anyone have any differing experiences with bringing their stateside employer on board and moving OCONUS that they would be willing to share?
I can share a little bit about my experience moving over to Japan. I am self-employed. I own a digital marketing agency that I opened 6 years ago now. Thank you. We've been in Japan for 2 years now. And so really it wasn't a question for me. It was just, how am I going to make this work? And similar to Laura's experience, the hours are a little tricky. I've got a team of 4 that's stateside. So a lot of the mornings I'm waking up around 4 a.m. to take East Coast calls, getting the kids to school, and then coming back and working. One of the challenges that I did have when I moved to Iwakuni was that I had to get base permission in order to operate my business. So I went to SJA and had to fill out a form, print out my website, and give them all my licensing information for the state so that they could prove that I was a legal entity. And one of the challenges that came along with that was that I had to be approved by MCCS because there was some form of competition because they had a marketing department that also solicited services. And so my marketing agency was kind of seen as a competitor. Everything was approved, so we're good to go. The only kind of hurdle that they have in place that we're working to get addressed now is that business registration is an annual process rather than being a rotation date-based process. So every year we have to go and re-register the company on base rather than it just sitting with our orders. That's just kind of another piece of paperwork we have to fill out. One other point I will add that I think is thoughtful to bring into somebody who is either looking to bring their job from the States to Japan or bring their own business is that on-base housing doesn't consider whether or not the spouse works for office space. So they only give you the number of rooms based on your husband or spouse's status, and then the number of dependents you have. We have 2 kids. We have a 3-bedroom house. So the girls share a room, and then I have my own office. However, if you are dealing with sensitive information, have client information that needs to remain locked, and you need a private space, there are no locks on the doors. So there's issues that I've brought up with housing that have not been addressed because these processes that we know as remote employees that need to go into place aren't being addressed or helped be facilitated towards on a local level.
Courtney, that's an excellent call out. Then something I've never lived on post before, so I don't know what that's like. But when we were building out the entrepreneur toolkit on Military One Source that's linked there, what we came across was that every installation had just such an absurd, like nothing was the same. Nothing was the same, even in the same country for the same, like Army base in Germany in Grafenwehr to register your home-based business was different than the other Army base at Rose Barracks, right? Like you're in this, like it was insane. So part of what we did while making that toolkit, we were working with the Military Family Community Policy Office under Patty Barron. And that was one of the things that we were like, this is BS, guys. We cannot have like 47 different ways to register a business in the same country for the same service. But you bring up a point that I haven't heard anyone talk about. So I'm going to take that note. That is an interesting thing that
I noted that as well. And so this is why we're having these conversations, is to bring up the things that are not necessarily talked about. And so one thing that kind of was asked in the poll question was, how easy was it for you to access SOFA? Can I ask, maybe by a raising of hands, the virtual option and or literal option, how many people felt like they were going through this process as if it was the first time anyone that they went to had ever heard of this? Because, okay, perfect. Someone who didn't raise their hand to say that this seemed like the first time, and maybe a person at a desk seemed confused about the process. Would you be willing to share that different opinion about that? If not, that's okay. If anyone is or willing to, okay, no problem. The other question I would ask is there a centralized resource that you were able to utilize that kind of pointed you in the right direction, whether that was posted on an installation website or you found it yourself through Military One Source, or what the source was? Can anyone, speak to, and this is not an official poll, but either by putting it in the chat or by coming off of mute and share, how did you access next steps when you were thinking about moving OCONUS, or when you needed to transfer that employment, or we're looking into it?
I'll just say, because it's still fresh in mind, there was no clear delineation on even the base's website on how to move your business over. And so the first person that I reached out to was SJA. I didn't want my husband to accept orders if I had to close down my business. So I reached out to them even before orders were issued to see if this was even a possibility. And so I got the confirmation that yes, it was possible. And these are the steps that you need to take in order to maintain your business here in Japan. The hiccup that I ran into was that nothing could get started until we were physically here. So there was a bit of a waiting game just to ensure that, like, okay, I did get base approval. I can operate and stay in business until we're physically present.
Courtney, what's SJA for the Army people in the room?
I believe it's Staff Judge Advocate.
Oh, okay. Okay. Got it.
I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. That makes sense.
Okay.
Does anyone else have a differing opinion or experience when it comes to accessing SOFA information that they'd be willing to share? And if you don't want to go off mute, feel free to put your experience in the chat and or email me. This is an area where there has been a lot of discussion about how to make the process more transparent for family members. So this is, a really important question if we can address some of those. I saw Laura, you came off of mute. Is that something you're willing to share?
Yeah, I was going to add one thing to what Courtney said and then share my own personal experience. So for Courtney, like, you made a phone call and you talked to someone, and I'm sure you probably just crossed your fingers that they gave you the right information, and you were going to PCS there and arrive and you get a different story. So, there really needs to be something in writing that they can send, like almost like a welcome aboard packet for SOFA. And then, my husband was in Yokosuka, Japan, and a lot of times they had a lot of hard issues recruiting people to come to those jobs. And it's just like, it's, such a retention thing for overseas. Overseas is a big ask for a lot of military families. And to be able to make that clear with someone who's bringing a business would be super helpful. But in my experience, I kind of, I knew that I was a low risk situation. So I Googled SOFA in Japan, and I kind of got a document to send to my employer to explain it for the first time. But, did I have the updated document? I don't know. Like, was my situation different because I'm telecommuting for base housing? I don't know. So, you can have a SOFA agreement, but a SOFA agreement in itself is 99.9% about the relation between that country and the military, not about spouses working. So I think that having more specific resources from bases would be super helpful, just to be able to call it out for military spouses and then for them to pass along to their employer who is probably hearing about this for the first time.
Quick definite point of view on SOFA, and if you all could also pay this one forward too. So the SOFA is your reason for being there, right? So it's like if you were going to go on vacation to Italy, you would typically get like a 90-day tourist visa, and you could tool around for 90 days before you needed to leave the country. If you were going to go overseas and your employer sent you, you would typically have like an A2 visa or some sort of a work visa. So when you're going overseas on military orders, the SOFA is your person's reason for being in the country legally. In most cases, it actually has nothing to do with employment. We've just been told that for a million years because these SOFAs were written before the internet existed. And so when the question initially that I suffered was, if my employer sponsored me to work, would that disrupt my SOFA status? And therefore, would it affect my service members' orders? Would it take me off of SOFA status and make him look unaccompanied? Like, nobody could answer that question 10 years ago, which is why I was forced to quit my job. So I think it's important to understand that the SOFA is for you personally. Work is a separate issue and conversation. I also wanted to share, you both were mentioning, the not being super clear on what you needed to do. If you haven't heard the news out of Italy recently, this is the link to the exchanging of letters that just happened in Italy. This is so crystal clear. Like, I think there's like 56 FAQs. I mean, it goes into the weeds on what it means to work in Italy, what you can and cannot do. We need to demand this level of clarity for every country that we are in. So if you have access to installation leadership, I would take this to them and demand that they go talk to the State Department and get this type of clarity. I just briefed all of the 4-stars in the Army Friday on this, and I have commitments from the combatant commanders overseas that they are going to do the same thing, but that's only Army. So for other branches of service, we need to demand that kind of same type of clarity.
Thanks, Beth. And I think, Amanda, did you want to share your response as well?
Yes. And I'm sorry, I'm on my phone here. So I just, when we were stationed in Japan, we were there from 98 to 05, and then from 2011 to 2017. And honestly, I didn't know what the SOFA status stuff was, especially when it came to business. I am self-employed myself. And when we were over there, it was very similar to having to go through the base, MCCS, get approved, and all those types of things. So I wanted to say I'm very thankful that people are taking the lead on this and getting this information out, because the area of support that I work in, I'm a birth doula and childbirth educator. A lot of people don't know these types of things, at least in my field when working overseas. And I just want to be able to help them navigate this and get a better understanding of how to get their businesses set up. And I do have a couple questions, I guess maybe that can come later on when it comes regarding like insurance and working overseas, when of those types of things. So I think, sorry.
No, I think that's great. And I think that these are the concerns that families have shared with me individually, wanting to bring more people together to better understand the problem. That's another concern and another layer. How does insurance work when you're working OCONUS? That's a huge question. And let's save those. I'm going to note that question to make sure we get back to it, but I want to make sure we touch on everything first. So as far as accessing the SOFA and understanding where to go, did anyone have any, to find next steps once you receive orders, or if orders, are in the air, so to speak? How do you go about accessing this information? What could be improved in that experience? Does anyone have any suggestions as to what you would have liked to see if your experience wasn't so smooth. And I think we've kind of touched, Laura, you touched on a suggestion of making it clear, and Beth, you kind of gave it best practice. Does anyone have any other thoughts or suggestions on that topic before we move on to other areas? Okay, I think we're doing great. I was a little touch concerned because this is the first time I've ever done something like this where it's a group interview, and you all are amazing. So and I don't know why I expected anything less. So that being said, I'm going to start the last poll question, and it's really focused on the barriers to employment. We know that there are a lot, and different locations have different barriers. And I know in this conversation we have most folks are in Japan, so maybe not all of these are the main concerns, but wanting to understand what is the major concern when it comes to working overseas. And it could be related to SOFA or slightly not. So feel free to answer that. And if anyone wants to go off mute and kind of talk to what they think is the primary barrier to them working overseas, if anyone's willing to share.
I think personally, when you move an entire family, an entire business, and you're adjusting to a completely new work schedule and still trying to maintain like your client workload, for me, it's really a misunderstanding within leadership in the culture of the military community of what it's like to have dual working parents, spouses. And this is like where I think we see the most friction, ensuring that our careers are seen as supportive of one another and not necessarily independent. So I think when you're a OCONUS, you're almost expected to be more present and giving to a community. And there's more of a time commitment to your squadron, your unit, than there necessarily is stateside. Speaking personally, the community here has been so much stronger than any other squadron we've been in stateside, but with that comes time. And for unit leadership to be able to understand that their Marine's spouse is fully employed too, and he has 2 kids, and he needs to be able to balance both. And mom's going back to the States for 2 weeks for meetings, so he's got to be able to figure out kids by himself, for some time. I think that having those types of talks so that the entire military environment can be more supportive of spouse employment is my largest barrier. And then there's a bunch of other little things I can add in later, but I think in order for my career to succeed, I need to have spouse support as well.
Does anyone have any additional thoughts about maybe a different barrier or benefit? I mean, let's be real. There are good things that could happen too. And although we hear a lot about the negative side, feel free. No one will hate on you for having a positive experience. We'll just wish that we could emulate it. So feel free to share an alternate experience if you feel comfortable.
So I can share a positive one. I just did this PCS by myself from Japan to Hawaii, and it like threw me for a loop more than United States to Japan. Part of that was because like we did have mandatory base housing, so I didn't have to do house hunting, right? I knew what I was moving into. And so that made it easier. The other thing that really surprised me about Japan is that while childcare was a really, really tough nut for me to crack, when I did finally crack it, it was amazing. And I qualified for a subsidy with the Japanese government as a working spouse. And I got my daughter's preschool tuition cut in half because of that. It took me about 30 hours to do the paperwork with a translator and like a lot of bureaucracy. But once I got it done, it was awesome. And then I was on the CDC wait list for 2 years for my son. So, and part of that was because of COVID, and I wasn't essential and I was part-time. So I was lowest pecking order, but when he did get in, it was amazing. So I think all in all, like I can speak to almost all those barriers that you mentioned. And I think overall, to be a working spouse OCONUS, you just have to be ruthlessly persistent, like in the paperwork to get it done, talking to your employer, finding childcare. Like we're all persistent as military spouses working stateside, but you have to be a special level of ruthlessly persistent, I feel like, overseas.
Got it. Yeah. Does anyone have anything else to share, a different experience that they would like to? Gabby?
Yeah, thank you so much for putting this on, Jennifer. This is awesome and so great to finally meet you after connecting on LinkedIn quite a bit. Courtney, to your point about command support and things like that. Background, so Navy veteran, now Navy spouse, or I guess we were dual male and now I've gotten out. And that one's we have a whole culture shift, right? To get into that. And so even I would have those conversations a lot with a lot of our senior leadership, and we have a long way to go to get rid of this idea of what a traditional family looks like. But that's beside the point. I just wanted to say that. So, but I think on my end and kind of what we're doing a little bit, and Amanda and I are kind of tackling this together is this the doula and lactation demo project that TRICARE is doing. And we've spent a lot of time talking with TRICARE overseas and what they want to do as far as, certifying doulas and things. TRICARE overseas is not tracking any of the SOFA stuff and any of these requirements. So we just had a meeting with them, and it's just like, we were like, what do you mean you haven't thought about this? Like, how are you going to expect to, their desire is to employ military spouses, right? That are doulas, that are IBCLCs, that are CLCs into this project, like we have CONUS. But we were like, okay, so how they have to have base approval, right? In most cases, most people don't know how to do that, right? As we've kind of discussed, it is a long process. What are your requirements going to be? How is that going to work with the governments of their local places, right? Italy being, I've been following that very closely, and I'm so glad to see those changes. But everywhere is different. And what about somebody going from, right, Beth, like you said, Germany to Japan, or vice versa? And how are you going to work that overseas? And they were like, what are you talking about? This isn't a problem. And I'm like, how are you going to certify, right, these spouses, expect them to have their own business, but there be no support or information around this? Like, this is and they were just like, oh, we'll get back to you. And I'm like, is this a Next Watches problem? Do you not care? I know they're talking to entities off base in some of these places to get them certified through TRICARE overseas to support military families. But I'm like, but that's not the point of what we're talking about in the NDAA and prioritizing spousal employment. 1, 2, how are you going to get them on base? You're going to talk to the base commanders about what that's going to do with ATFP? Like, and they're like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, guys, we roll this out next year. Right. And so, and that's one of my biggest concerns is, is leading this organization and doing the advocacy front. Spouses overseas, you need the most support. You're giving birth out there alone. You're going through infant feeding and maternal mental health alone in some cases. And you can't bring mom or dad or other support person out if your spouse is deployed. What's the plan? There's no plan. And they are not thinking about this. And that's our biggest concern.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. If anyone else has any other thoughts or experiences, I mean, we can go back, and I have a few more questions, no more polling questions, but does anyone else have anything to share about their primary barrier to employment? Or if you're looking to move overseas, what was something a barrier you're still looking to, you maybe have an unanswered question, if anyone else wants to share. And if not, I'll ask some more questions. Or if Beth, you have anything else to say? Oh, Courtney.
No, I think that Gabby and Amanda are hitting on something that no one has really, to your point, obviously they haven't thought about, because and if there are any nurses on the line, I'm sure they can relate to this. They think about spouses being nurses, right? And so then they say, go volunteer at the Red Cross, give us some free woman power. Or like, wait your time in line to get a job at the clinic on post, right? I had a girlfriend who was a doula in Korea, and she just did it with the families and charged them directly. And she just went to she just fully was ruthlessly persistent, Laura, to your point. And she just sort of like kicked down doors and kicked her way in. Was it legal? I don't know. But did she do it for 2 years? Absolutely. But you guys are hitting on something that I mean, I'm wondering what other healthcare type professions are unrepresented in this situation, because this is an interesting problem that,
And
and
what
you've got the added bureaucracy of TRICARE being involved too.
And what you just brought up, Beth, is like something that I know I experienced too, is I don't know if I'm operating illegally. And that's the thing, that because I think that we aim for the best fit or the following the rules and as best we can. But if no one can answer those questions for us, or they, to someone's point, like hand off to someone else, it does feel a little risky, even though, I mean, that had been my experience but it was freelancing. So I was like, I'm certainly not making enough money to, get somebody knocking on my door and saying, Jen, you owe taxes. But it is something that is an important theme that you all brought up, is that not being sure, it sounds like, but please correct me if that is not an accurate assessment of what you all shared. Courtney, did you want to share something?
Yeah, just to chime in on the healthcare. Well, Iwakuni is known for having very limited documents sent to me if I have unemployment notices from the states in which I employ my employees back in the United States. If they send me, tax notices, all of that has to go to a physical address, my in-laws in North Carolina, and then I have to get a picture of the document, or they have to send it in a different envelope to our FPO address. Is there a reason or implication around why we can't have business mail sent?
Because you can't use a government entity to make money. This is the dumbest thing. So when I was in Germany, I'm trying to remember what it was. It was maybe Pampered Chef. It was maybe Rodan and Fields. I don't remember, but same thing. These spouses could not fulfill people's orders because they couldn't ship to their APO or their FPO because they were making money off of it, right? And that is just outdated, really, really outdated language that is a part of, and that actually exists in every single SOFA, about not using the federal government to make money outside profit. It's the same reason, like in Germany, the SFRGs, or the family readiness groups, if we wanted to do a fundraiser, and we wanted to order stuff from like Amazon or Walmart, and if we were going to make money off of it, for the most part, we just did it and whatever, but don't put it past a cranky post office marshal to stop the fun for everybody. But that is just outdated language that needs to be addressed.
Does anyone else encounter that? The mail, sorry for the disruption. My internet is insane with my children playing on tablets. So sorry about that. Does anyone else have any other mail related disruptions or similarly small or nuanced things that impacted their business or their employment that they had to consider? So mail is one really great example that has been in existence for a long time, but I suspect there's more than just that. It was brought up having a place to operate your business, whether it's housing. So that's another really great example. Is there any other example of these little barriers that maybe aren't necessarily considered by DoD, but are actual barriers for you to be able to perform your job effectively? Any other thoughts? And if there's not, that's okay too.
I would say, again, it is maybe because I'm on a small military base, but stable Wi-Fi. If AmeriCable is out, we're out of business. I can't do anything. And there's no common space to be able to work remotely that isn't, a Japanese cafe, and hours here are very different. It's 9 to 5 for a lot of shops that are open. So what I've proposed and advocated for is to have a community center on base, where they could even lease out office space and make money off of it. I'm like, MCCS, this is another revenue stream for you. Just rent out private office space, have key card access so somebody can get there 24 hours if they're working odd hours stateside. But the Wi-Fi connection and capability, and then just having the physical space to be able to work.
Anyone else have any thoughts? And feel free, if you don't want to go off mute, you can drop it in the chat as well.
Courtney, a quick update on that. So the USO is working on that stateside and also Oconus. So I think we have 9 sponsored like co-working stations. And I think I mentioned at the top, I work for Amazon. I actually work for AWS, which is like our cloud computing side. I wrote a whole policy paper for our public policy team on this exact thing, on why this should be an effort that AWS leans into, because we have satellite capabilities that can solve this problem. I talked about lack of internet in rural areas where there's military installations and overseas. So while this isn't going to solve your problem right now, that is something that is being worked on, and there should be a solve for rural installations stateside and then rural small installations Oconus.
Awesome. Thanks for that update. So I have no more polling questions. So I want to give everyone an opportunity to bring up anything that we didn't necessarily get to talk about, but you think is important to this conversation. If not, if you also want to ask questions, Beth is clearly a wonderful expert and has a lot of resources available, as well as knowledge. So we'll kind of open it up to anyone who wants to share, but I would just ask that, like, if someone's off mute, then just you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat that you want to share. Anyone want to go first? I know we mentioned insurance. That was something that was brought up before. Did you want to restate that, the question, or Beth, did you kind of gather what that question was about and have any thoughts about how insurance works while you're working Oconus? Have you worked on that at all?
Insurance is going to be country by country, unfortunately. And I'm not super familiar with Japan. And it'll also be profession by profession. So I'm also the board chair of the Military Spouse Chamber of Commerce. So selfish plug for all of you business owners, go register. It's free to register, and you get a bunch of info. But I know what a lot of our business owners have done is they've again leaned into the Military Spouse Residency Relief Act. That's also how they manage their unemployment insurance. Which even stateside, that's just a hot mess. I mean, Courtney, if you're dealing with unemployment insurance. So that is right now sort of the safest option people are leaning into is the Military Spouse Residency Relief Act, like location-based stuff. The changes in Italy does reference sort of how to manage that. If you look at one of the bajillion FAQs, it's in there, which again is maybe not every question in that Italian update is like, maybe I don't love the answer, but it's an answer. It is in black and white and crystal clear. And we all deserve that clarity, for regardless of where we live. So I will again, like double foot stomp to say, please take that to your installation leadership and say, hey, how do we need to get this level of clarity?
Anyone else want to share or ask any questions?
I've got a question for Beth. So I've been Oconus twice, once in Bahrain where there was no sofa. So we were in like this weird area where there isn't a sofa, but we're still Oconus. And then I've been in Japan. I've never been in Germany or Italy. And in my mind, just from what I've been reading about SOFA over the years on spouse Facebook groups, etc., is that there are like shades of SOFA, and the strictest, highest level is like Germany, and then Japan is like somewhere in the middle, and then Bahrain's at the bottom because there is no SOFA. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that as far as like the restrictiveness, or like, is my mentality correct in like the shades of SOFA as far as like a level of strictness?
Yeah, so Bahrain has an executive agreement, which is like not a sofa, but a sofa. So there's buckets of sofa. So the NATO has their like a blanket sofa for NATO. And some countries within NATO have their own like amendments to it. Italy, Germany, Spain, Belgium, they all have like their own version of an amendment to it. Japan's and Korea's sofas, while ancient, are actually newer. And Japan and Korea kind of have a very, very similar stipulations in their sofa. It's really just about because the sofas were invented for the legal protection of service members, and that's sort of where Japan and Korea kind of lay their focus. And again, none of the sofas actually mention employment, except for Germany does say that like a certain percentage of on post or on base jobs must be reserved for local nationals. And so, but it doesn't mention anything about like you and either working for yourself or working on the economy. So there are, yes, I like that. There are shades of the sofa. And a lot of it, like, for example, Germany, it came from this, like, well, this is how we've always done it, right? So when I was personally victimized by the SOFA, it was in Germany. And I went to every JAG, every local national lawyer I could find. And I said, show me in the SOFA where it says I cannot work. Because right now I'm not seeing it. So it doesn't say I can't. So I can, right? And it was like, well, this is the way it's always been. This is the way it's always been. This is the way it's always been. And it wasn't until, this generation of spouses that we started demanding clarity on this, demanding to work, that like people were starting to feel the pressure. So now Germany does have, if I will find it, it's on my other computer, damn it. They do have like a 96-page brochure on SOFA. It's still, German and restrictive, but it is a little bit, it's better than it was. There is some information out there. But the SOFAs are all owned by the State Department. They are implemented, for lack of a better word, by DOD, and then they are ratified by the Senate, and they have to be mutually agreed upon by both countries. So to get like a tri-agency dual country agreement situation happening is a nightmare, which is why it has been so hard to sort of move like things forward with the status of forces agreement. Having said all of that, you may have also heard like, well, we can't open the SOFA. We can't renegotiate the SOFA because then we'll have to renegotiate everything. That is just patently not true. We make amendments to SOFAs all the time. We made amendments to them in Europe to allow for vehicles, but we didn't make amendments to allow spouses to work. Like, come on. So I will get off my soapbox. I didn't really answer your question. I'm sorry. Yes, there are shades of SOFA.
That was good. No, you really did answer my question. So that was interesting to hear about how they all have different pieces and, they have or have not mentioned anything about spouse. It sounds like they really don't mention spouse employment. It's just a gray area.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. And Beth, I have a question for you, and maybe this might benefit everyone, is if you were to want to share concern about the SOFA with a leader, where would you recommend they reach out? Obviously, you mentioned installation leadership about, promoting available information, but who would they go to if they wanted to voice a concern?
So you are going to get the most movement where you are locally. So I would start with your, I'm Army, so I'm going to mess up the term, your squadron commander. Like I would go up the layers of the chain there. I would also get JAG involved, because when the American Bar Association passed a resolution this summer, it essentially it told all lawyers, we now have an opinion on this. And so for those JAG officers that were like, I don't really know, they now have an opinion on this. Also important to note, when you're talking to JAG, you are not talking about employment, because JAG officers legally cannot provide employment law advice. What you are talking about is taxes, because that is where the actual rub with SOFA happens. JAG officers can advise you on tax and SOFA. Like, you would think that you're an attorney, be smart enough to know that when I'm asking you about employment, what I really mean. No, you got to be super deliberate with them. So I would go up your base command chain. I would also go up your the JAG command chain, and then this is a frustrating answer, but in terms of DOD, because the status of forces agreement is owned by the State Department, there is not someone at DOD that is formally ushering this along. That has fallen to one angry Army spouse who's been on a hellbent mission for 10 years to fix it. And when I briefed the 4 stars last weekend on this, that was one thing they said. They said, who's representing this at DOD? And when the answer was the person who works for AWS, there was kind of an immediate like, well, that's not okay. That's not all right. We need someone inside DOD that can like answer the mail on this. Right now, Eddie Menser, he works at DOD. You can, send him some helpful information. He may or may not get back to you, but there is not like a formal action officer ushering SOFA along, unfortunately.
So alternatively, because this is considered like a reverse town hall, what do you want your leaders to know? Because that's the purpose of this. It's not just of course it's sharing your experiences to inform like articles that are written about this, but it's also, what would you want to put in there if you were writing it? What do you want people to know about, either positive, negative, anywhere in between? And we'll close on that because we have only a few minutes left. But if anyone has anything to share, and if not, that's fine too.
I would say, and looking at this from a leadership perspective, right, is that I'm gonna want to know like what kind of shitstorm I'm gonna deal with as a base CO, right? And so, for example, like taking this TRICARE situation thing, I'm gonna use that as a specific example because that's where I live, right? Is you know, it's gonna be an absolute shitstorm, and I would want to know, right, what the plan is well ahead so I can prep what I need to, right? Because JAG's gonna be involved and Spacio and that the triad's going to be involved, and this is going to take, depending on how many people, right, you have coming in, and then what overseas TRICARE is going to say, and it's going to be a lot of meetings and a lot of time. So I would just, right, want to be forward leaning and proactive and asking the right questions. Or are we going to use locals, right, to come on base, and what that's going to look like for me from a security standpoint too. So I would just say there just needs to be a very, very, very clear guidance from, in this case, right, DHA, whoever you're working with, down. And then if it's the local community, right, or spouses as well, up in what needs to happen and what information we need to get these approvals going, right? Like we have to have malpractice insurance. Like, how's that going to work overseas, and who are you going to use? And so, I would just kind of be, that's where I'm kind of at.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Anyone else have anything to share? No, it's okay. Thank you guys so much for sharing. Please do not hesitate to email. And Beth, I wrote a note to remind you to get that Germany file. So we'll send out all of the links and things. I will come out with a summary of the conversation. And obviously this will impact, the future articles that I write on the topic. We're hosting another call tomorrow morning, our time, which right now it's evening in the Pacific time zone. And so we're hosting another one focused on the European SOFA, but all of these things layered together will kind of help inform the conversation. I hope to hold more conversations like this on different topics. And so if you have any thoughts, I know I did ask for suggestions as to what you'd like to hear about in the future in the registration. So feel free, if you have other thoughts or would like to talk about different things, email me. The purpose of this is to get to make it so that you do not have to start a nonprofit in order to have your voice heard. Also, to help inform the articles written on this topic and hopefully connect you more directly with people who are making these decisions, who eventually will access these recordings, is my hope and dream. I don't know. It could just be us chatting, and that's also good. But thank you again for bearing with me as I'm learning this process and going with it. But don't hesitate to reach out. But on the note, I'll stay on. If Beth, you want to stay on, I'm going to be here for a few more minutes if anyone else wants to share. But otherwise, I'll give you back 2 minutes of your day, not very many. But thanks so much for joining, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for hosting and providing us, a table to sit at and speak at. I really appreciate it. And I learned, I think, like 5 new things today. So really, really appreciate your time too.
Of course. Okay.
Yes.
Talking to families is like the least that I can do. And I do it all the time, but I do it one by one. And that this just feels more natural, is to have a conversation about these topics, because we learn from each other. And I'm going to miss something in the article that we could just have a better, more fruitful conversation by talking it out and then using that information later to write an article. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. And I want to say thank you for Beth for fighting the good fight over these last 10 years and advocating for the future of military spouses. So we're really grateful for that. And, I always tell people, as much as we have frustrations, there's no better time to be a military spouse than now, because of how much opportunity we have. And I want the next generation of military spouses to experience that as well.
Yeah. And I honestly, these are solvable problems. And like, just because it's hard doesn't mean that we should be like, no, you're right, it's hard. Like, no, this is solvable. Come on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, again, thanks everybody. And like I said, I'll be in touch via email, getting you connected. I'm gonna probably send out the summary. It's gonna be on my Substack, which you do not have to pay for it. It's a free version, and you can just look at the information that's there eventually. But I'll collect your emails and put it over there and send it out once it's ready. But
Cool.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Katie, did you want to share anything? Oh, here.